0544. Imagine you are standing on the command deck of a Korath Reaver dreadnought in the Tannhäuser Reach. You have 40 plasma batteries, 200 warriors, and a standing kill order from the Reaver Council to hunt down every human runner crossing the drift. You spot a signature on the long-range scope, a small, slow-looking freighter cutting across the dust at an angle your dreadnought could never match. You give the order to pursue. Your gunners scramble, the reactors spool. The chase begins. And for the next 6 hours, you watch that freighter get smaller and smaller on your sensors, until it vanishes completely into a dust corridor your ship cannot enter without tearing itself apart. That ship was a Halberd-class runner, and it did not just outrun you, it humiliated you. For nearly 2 centuries, the Halberd was the single greatest advantage humans had over the most powerful warships in known space. Smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable than anything the conquered naval authority or the Reaver clans could put in the void, this freighter turned frontier humans into ghosts. They could strike conquered supply convoys, slip past Reaver patrols, and disappear before the dreadnoughts even finished charging their main guns. The great irony is that the Halberd was not designed by pirates. It was designed by people trying to build a legitimate ice-hauling industry in the Jovian Belt. The humans on the frontier just figured out what it could really do. So how did a civilian freighter built for moving water ice from Ganymede become the most feared vessel in the outer drift? How did it change the way humans operated, the way the conquered fought, and the way an entire galactic empire eventually had to rewrite its naval doctrine? To understand that, we need to go back to where it all started, and we need to look at a map. Let's picture the human Sol system around the year 2287. From the cold mining stations of Ceres down through the orbital yards of Ganymede and out to the helium refineries of Saturn, human shipwrights were solving a problem that had nothing to do with combat. They needed a vessel that could handle the brutal, unpredictable environment of the outer planets. A ship that could navigate the dense particulate halos around the gas giants, where larger vessels would lose their bearings entirely. Something fast enough to make a return run before the cargo sublimated. Something tough enough to survive a magnetic squall without losing its navigation core. Now zoom out. Follow the early jump gate routes outward from Sol, past the Centauri colonies, past the disputed worlds of the Felsen Expanse, and into the outer drift. Thousands of dust nebulae scattered across cold, dark void. Rogue moons drifting between unclaimed systems. Ion storm corridors that ran for light years. Hidden gravity wells just beneath the visible currents that would shred the hull of a deep-keeled warship. Coves of frozen debris tucked behind the magnetic shadows of dead stars. This is the geography that made human piracy possible. And this is the geography the Halberd was accidentally built to dominate. The name Halberd is itself a piece of mistaken identity. The first prototype was supposed to be called the Harbinger, but a clerk in the Ganymede yards misfiled the registry papers, and the name stuck. The commonly accepted story places the first true Halberd launch at the Ganymede orbital docks in the spring of 2287. A shipwright named Andrew Cabrera, working with a small team of engineers who had been pushed out of the Concord's official certification program, designed a freighter with a radical new propulsion system. And when it cleared the docking clamps and rode its first magnetic eddy out toward Europa, a yard supervisor watching from the observation deck reportedly said, "Look at her sail." Whether that quote is real or a piece of frontier mythology dressed up over the centuries, the timing is documented. By the early 2290s, halberds were appearing all along the human frontier, and the design was unlike anything the wider galaxy had seen. Traditional conquered warships, the kind that dominated the inner systems, were built around massive fixed-vector ion drives. These engines were spectacular in open void. A conquered destroyer running a clean burn between jump gates was one of the fastest things in known space. But the moment the environment got complicated, the moment the ship needed to maneuver inside a dust field or thread between magnetic shears, everything fell apart. Turning a conquered destroyer inside a nebula was like trying to drive a freight train through a forest. It required a crew of dozens monitoring sensors, recalculating vectors, and physically adjusting the angle of enormous engine pods. It took time, and time was the one thing you did not have when a human runner was getting away. The halberd threw all of that out. Instead of fixed vector drives, it used gravimetric sails. Thin filament arrays, kilometers long when fully deployed, that extended from the ship's spine and caught the natural magnetic currents flowing through nebulae and gravity wells. The sails ran along the length of the hull, mounted on collapsible booms that could be retracted in seconds. This configuration changed everything about how a ship interacted with its environment. A halberd could sail much closer to a gravity gradient than a fixed-drive warship. Where a conquered destroyer might need an open vector and a clean magnetic field, a halberd could ride directly across a dust corridor and still make forward progress. Pilots called this trim running, and the halberd's trim was extraordinary. But trim was only part of the equation. The other half was the hull. Halberd hulls were narrow, lightly armored, and built for signature reduction. Where a conquered cruiser might broadcast a gravitational shadow the size of a small moon, a halberd's shadow was barely larger than an asteroid. This meant halberds could fly directly through ion storms that would scramble a warship's sensors. They could slip past conquered listening posts, drift past reaver patrol routes, and emerge in regions of space where no military vessel could follow them. Combine the low signature with the gravimetric sail rig, and you had a vessel that could do things no other ship could. It could accelerate from a dead stop faster than anything in the void. It could change heading in a fraction of the time it took a destroyer. It could sail in conditions, thin nebulae, shifting magnetic fields, tight asteroid clusters, that would leave a fixed-drive warship completely blind. And it could do all of this with a tiny crew. A halberd that might be 100 meters long could be flown by as few as 4 people. A comparable conquered patrol cruiser needed 60. For human runners, a small crew meant a bigger share of the cargo for everyone on board. It also meant that if things went badly, only 4 people had to disappear. Building a halberd was itself a different process than building a conquered warship. Conquered vessels were constructed in massive orbital shipyards by certified guild teams following design documents stamped by the Naval Authority. The process took years and cost a fortune. A single conquered destroyer required raw materials from a dozen systems and the labor of thousands. Halberds were built in small frontier yards by handfuls of shipwrights, who often worked from inherited blueprints and direct experience rather than official certification. The materials were whatever was available. In the Jovian belt, that meant cold-rolled titanium for the frames and salvaged conquered plating for the hull. In the outer drift, where human runners often modified or rebuilt captured vessels, the materials were stranger. Reaver alloy, scavenged from the wrecks of failed pursuers. Crystalline polymer harvested from rogue moons. These frontier-built halberds were sometimes even faster than the originals, because the unconventional materials allowed thinner plating without sacrificing structural integrity, which meant less mass in the hull and more thrust from the sails. The keel of a halberd was its central truss, a single long spine running the length of the ship. The ribs branched outward from the truss and gave the hull its shape. Then the plating went on, sheet by sheet, fastened with magnetic locks and cold welds. The whole process could be completed in a matter of weeks by an experienced yard team. Compare that to the years it took to commission a conquered destroyer, and you start to understand why halberds multiplied so quickly along the frontier. Human runners rarely built their own halberds from scratch. They took them. A common tactic was to intercept a civilian freight convoy, transfer the cargo, and either steal the halberd outright or convert it for combat use. Some runners modified their captured ships extensively, cutting new gun emplacements, reinforcing the spine to handle the recoil of heavier kinetic batteries, and trimming the sail filaments for maximum acceleration. Others left them mostly stock, figuring that the original design was already fast enough, and any modifications might actually slow it down. The simplicity of the halberd also made repairs easy. If a sail filament tore or a plating section was punctured, a runner crew could anchor the ship inside a dust pocket, patch the damage with whatever materials were available, and be back under sail in a day. A conquered destroyer with the same damage might need to limp back to a fleet yard halfway across the sector. Now, to understand why human runners loved the halberd, you need to understand how piracy actually worked in the outer drift. Forget the dramatic version told in conquered propaganda, with human warships firing broadsides at honest cargo haulers. Most human raids were not battles. They were ambushes. The typical runner operation looked like this. You found a spot along a known supply route, ideally near a narrow dust corridor or the magnetic shadow of a rogue moon where conquered convoys had to pass. You waited, hidden inside the murk, your sails furled and your reactor running cold. When a target appeared, you came out fast, ran up alongside, and either intimidated the convoy escorts into standing down or fired a few warning shots to make your point clear. Speed was everything. Not because you needed to catch the convoy. Most conquered supply ships were slow, overloaded cargo haulers. Speed mattered because of what came after. Once you took the cargo, or the passengers, you needed to be gone before anyone could send a real warship after you. This is where the halberd became the perfect tool. A runner in a halberd could anchor inside a dust pocket that was too dense for any destroyer to enter. When a target appeared, the halberd could deploy its sails and accelerate out of hiding before the convoy even understood what was happening. After the raid, the halberd could run in any direction the magnetic currents allowed. And because of its gravimetric rig, the currents almost always allowed at least one good escape route. If a conquered warship appeared on long-range sensors during the attack, the runner simply turned across the nearest gravity gradient and sailed away at an angle the destroyer could not match. If the destroyer tried to follow, the chase quickly turned into an exercise in frustration. The halberd would tack back and forth, zigzagging through magnetic eddies, while the destroyer fell farther and farther behind with every adjustment. And if the destroyer somehow got close, the runner had one final card to play: dense particulate. A halberd with its sails furled could drift directly into an ion storm or a Class 4 dust cloud. The destroyer, with its broad gravitational shadow and its fixed vector drive, would have to stop or risk losing its sensors completely. The runner would simply sail into space that was too dangerous to follow, wait for the destroyer to give up, and then slip away to the next pocket of the drift. This was not a theoretical advantage. This happened over and over and over again throughout the late 2300s. Conquered captains wrote furious reports back to naval headquarters describing the impossible task of catching humans in halberds. They begged for faster ships. They begged for smaller ships. They begged for anything that could actually keep up. Commander Cellini Marrow of the destroyer Iron Veil wrote about chasing a halberd for 9 standard hours through the edge of the Tannhäuser Reach, only to watch it disappear into a dust corridor she could not enter. Her ship's signature was too large. Her sensors were already going blind from the particulate. By the time she found a way around the corridor, the runner was 3 sectors away. Governor Idris, home of the frontier outpost Halcyon Reach, filed 17 formal complaints in a single fiscal cycle, each one more elaborate than the last. He once wrote that trying to catch a human runner with a conquered destroyer was like trying to swat a fly with a hammer the size of a building. He requested smaller ships. He was denied. He requested smaller ships again. He was denied again. He requested smaller ships a third time and was told, in writing, that the conquered naval authority did not build small ships and would not be starting now. These were not exaggerations. The physics were simply against them. A conquered destroyer trying to follow a halberd through a magnetic field had to maintain a fixed vector, while the runner could ride the currents at any angle. Over the course of a 6-hour pursuit through a nebula, a halberd might cover 3 times the effective distance of its pursuer. The destroyer captain could watch the gap widening on the sensor display, hour after hour, knowing there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The response from the naval authority was often maddeningly bureaucratic. The conquered fleet was designed to fight other fleets, not chase down small, fast raiders. Its ships were built for firepower, not signature reduction. Retooling the entire navy to deal with frontier piracy would have been enormously expensive, and the species making budget decisions in the conquered core worlds were many light years from the problem. Some of the most famous human runners of the Drift era understood the halberd's advantages better than anyone. Hollis Drayton, one of the founding figures of the free port at Halcyon Reach, operated halberds extensively in the dust corridors near the inner Tannhäuser. Drayton recognized that the magnetic currents around the Reach were essentially a natural fortress for anyone in a low-signature vessel. He set up a network of supply caches inside dust pockets that no conquered ship could reach, and he sailed his halberd between them like a fisherman working a familiar coastline. His protege was a man named Marcus Vance. You may know him as the man who once held an entire conquered trade hub hostage for 11 days. Vance is famous for his flagship, the Black Aurora, a heavily modified former conquered light cruiser that he captured early in his career and refitted with experimental armor. But here is what gets overlooked. Vance operated a small fleet, and the workhorses of that fleet were halberds. When Vance blockaded the supply hub at Arundel Station in 2347, one of the most audacious acts of human piracy on record, he used the Black Aurora to intimidate and his halberds to actually chase down and capture the freighters trying to slip out the back. The halberds were the teeth of the operation. They were the ships that could actually run down a fleeing convoy in the dense magnetic murk around the station. When a conquered freighter tried to make a break for open void, Vance did not send the Black Aurora lumbering after it. He sent 2 halberds. By the time the freighter captain realized what was happening, the halberds were already alongside, sail filaments retracted, boarding teams climbing across the hull. The Black Aurora was the flag, the symbol, the thing that made conquered officials terrified. But the halberds did the real work. Calvin Reeve was another runner who relied heavily on halberds, and his career was something else entirely. Reeve operated primarily in the Tannhäuser middle layer, the densest and least mapped region of the drift. His preferred tactic was coordinated swarm raiding. Hide 6 halberds in 6 different dust pockets along a supply route, wait for a convoy to pass, and have them emerge simultaneously from 6 different angles. The convoy escorts could engage 1, maybe 2. The others took whatever they wanted and disappeared. Reeve's career demonstrates both the power of the halberd and the frustration it caused the conquered. In 2351, naval authorities sent an entire destroyer squadron, the 22nd Pursuit Group, to eliminate Reeve's operation. The squadron spent 8 months in the Tannhäuser Reach and lost 2 destroyers to ion storm damage. They captured no runners. Reeve continued operating for another 4 years after the squadron withdrew. Every time a destroyer appeared, the same pattern repeated. Pursuit, frustration. The halberd disappearing into the murk or sailing into space too dense to follow. Naomi Karsh, arguably the most successful raider of the era, also made extensive use of halberds in her operations. Karsh's career produced over 600 documented captures, a staggering number that dwarfs every other human runner of the period. Her operational model was essentially industrial-scale raiding, and halberds were critical to that model. Karsh would use her larger captured cruisers as floating bases at the edge of dust fields, and send halberds ahead to scout, to chase, and to cut off convoy escape routes. The halberds functioned as the fast attack element of a larger tactical system. They could cover more void, check more hiding spots, and respond to opportunities faster than any single large vessel could. When Karsh identified a conquered convoy worth taking, her halberds would fan out across the supply route, identifying the weakest ships, the ones lagging behind or running with damaged escorts. By the time the convoy realized it was under attack, the halberds had already isolated their targets. And then there was Theo Linwood. Linwood is mostly remembered today because of who sailed with him. Annika Voss and Marisol Cuvas, two of the most documented female runners of the era, served as his lieutenants. But his story also illustrates how central the halberd was to runner operations at every level. Linwood did not command a fleet. He was not Vance. He was not Karsh. He was a small-time operator running a single halberd through the magnetic shadows around the edge of the drift, picking off lone freighters and isolated supply runners. His halberd was his entire operation. It was his ship, his home, his escape vehicle, and his only real asset. When the conquered bounty hunter Julian Marsh finally caught up with Linwood in late 2358, it was specifically because Linwood had anchored his halberd inside a dust pocket near a small mining outpost, and his crew had spent 2 days drinking captured spirits and trading stories with the miners. Marsh's pursuit cutter caught them at anchor, sails furled, reactor cold. They could not run. If Linwood had been under sail, if he had seen Marsh coming with even an hour of warning, his halberd would have been gone. Marsh would have been filing another frustrated report about a runner he could not catch. Instead, Linwood, Voss, and Cuvas were all captured and brought back to the inner systems for trial. The lesson was not lost on other runners. The halberd could save your life, but only if you were actually sailing it. Wilbur Hatch, the so-called gentleman runner, provides yet another angle on the halberd story. Hatch was the son of a wealthy Centauri trading family who, for reasons that baffled everyone including his own crew, decided to become a frontier raider in 2353. He bought a halberd, named it the Recompense, and set out to raid conquered shipping. Hatch was a terrible runner. He had no piloting experience and no combat training, but he had enough money to buy a fast ship, and that ship kept him alive far longer than his skills should have allowed. When things went badly, which was often, the speed of his halberd gave him the option to flee. The conquered caught him eventually, as they usually did when a runner made enough mistakes, but the fact that an incompetent amateur survived for over a year as a raider says everything about how much the ship itself mattered. But the halberd's influence on human piracy went beyond individual captains and their tactics. It fundamentally changed the economics of raiding. Before the halberd became widely available, frontier piracy was a high-cost, high-risk operation. You needed a large captured vessel, a large crew, significant supplies, and heavy armament. The startup costs, if you want to think of it that way, were enormous. This limited piracy to well-organized groups with serious backing, often former conquered privateers who already had ships from sanctioned wartime raiding. The halberd democratized piracy. A small group of humans with limited resources could acquire or build a halberd relatively cheaply. They did not need dozens of guns or hundreds of crew. 4 people in a fast halberd with a few mounted batteries could take a conquered freighter just as effectively as a crew of 200 in a cruiser. Maybe more effectively, because the halberd could get close before the freighter even knew it was being approached. And when the cargo was divided among 4 people instead of 200, each person walked away rich. A single successful raid on a convoy carrying medical supplies, rare minerals, or refined fuel could set a small crew up for a year. This is why human piracy in the outer drift exploded in the mid-2300s. The halberd lowered the barrier to entry. Suddenly, discharged human spacers, unemployed colonial pilots, escaped indentured workers, and anyone else with void skills and nothing to lose could go on the account. All they needed was a fast ship and a willingness to use violence. The proliferation of halberd-based piracy created a strategic nightmare for the conquered. The problem was not any single runner. The problem was that there were hundreds of them scattered across thousands of light-years of frontier space and dozens of dust nebulae, each operating independently in vessels that no destroyer could reliably catch. Traditional conquered doctrine relied on concentration of force. Send a powerful squadron to a known pirate base, attack it, destroy the pirates. This worked against large static targets. It did not work against hundreds of small, fast ships that could relocate overnight. The conquered tried adapting. The Naval Authority began purchasing and commissioning its own pursuit cutters for frontier patrol. These smaller vessels could, in theory, match the runners in speed and signature. But there were problems. First, there were never enough of them. The Conquered's priorities were core world politics, not frontier policing. Ships, officers, and funding were allocated based on the strategic priorities of the inner systems, and frontier piracy, while annoying, was rarely the top concern. Second, even when the Conquered had fast ships, finding human runners was still enormously difficult. The outer drift is vast. The dust nebulae stretch for hundreds of light years. A halberd anchored inside a magnetic shadow was essentially invisible unless you sailed directly past it. Without reliable intelligence about runner movements, Conquered patrols were often drifting in circles, burning through supplies without ever finding a target. Third, the political situation was a mess. Different frontier governors had different attitudes toward human runners. Some actively sheltered them because runner spending was good for the local economy. Others were sympathetic because the runners targeted Conquered ships, not local traffic. Coordinating counter-piracy operations across multiple frontier jurisdictions was nearly impossible. The Conquered eventually found solutions, but they were rarely elegant. The most effective tool turned out to be not a better ship, but better intelligence. Informants, paid spies, turned runners, and captured crew members provided the information that Conquered commanders needed to set traps. The strategy shifted from chasing runners to predicting where they would be. If you knew a runner was operating in a specific supply lane, you could position pursuit cutters at both ends of the lane and squeeze inward. If you knew a runner was using a particular dust pocket as a base, you could send a low-signature cutter in while a destroyer waited outside the field to block the exit. This intelligence-based approach worked slowly. It did not eliminate human piracy overnight, but it changed the calculus for runners. The halberd could still outrun a destroyer in open void, but it could not outrun a trap set with advanced knowledge. And then, in 2374, something happened that no Conquered historian had predicted. A Conquered investigative auditor named Vesna Home, the niece of the same Governor Home who had filed all those complaints decades earlier, was assigned to review the cargo manifests of captured human runners. She expected to find stolen industrial supplies, refined fuel, weapons. She found those things. But she also found something else. Across hundreds of captured manifests, spanning decades, she found one consistent anomaly. Every successful runner crew, regardless of their stated targets or methods, had at some point in their career been carrying passengers. Reaver passengers. Children, elders, families. Always small groups, always moved through the densest parts of the drift, always offloaded at coordinates that did not appear on any Conquered map. Home investigated further. She cross-referenced the coordinates against Conquered military operations from the same period. The pattern that emerged broke her career. The Reaver clans, the species the Conquered had spent 2 centuries describing as savage raiders preying on civilized space, had been a displaced people. Their home system had been claimed by the Conquered during the expansion era, and the surviving Reaver populations had been pushed outward into marginal regions of the drift. Conquered patrols had been quietly conducting what the official reports called containment operations against Reaver settlements for over 100 years. The human runners had known. They had known from the beginning. Hollis Drayton had known. Marcus Vance had known. Naomi Karsh had known. Every major runner crew had been quietly evacuating Reaver families through the dust corridors. Hiding them inside the same magnetic shadows the runners used to escape Conquered pursuit. The cargo raids were partly real and partly a cover. The runners had been stealing Conquered supplies, yes, but they had also been stealing Conquered attention, drawing destroyers into pointless pursuits while quieter halberds slipped through the back corridors carrying refugees. When Vesna Holm filed her report, the conquered naval authority spent 6 months trying to suppress it. They failed. The report leaked into the civilian press. The political consequences reshaped the inner systems for a generation. 3 admirals resigned. The naval authority was restructured. The containment operations were officially ended, though the damage they had done could not be undone. And the human runners, the people the conquered had spent 2 centuries calling pirates, were quietly reclassified in the official histories, not as heroes. The conquered could not bring itself to go that far, but not as criminals either. The new term, used in modern conquered textbooks, is frontier irregulars. It is a phrase that carries no judgment and no apology. But the halberd did not disappear when the runner era ended. Far from it. The same qualities that made it perfect for piracy made it perfect for legitimate work. Halberds became the backbone of frontier commerce throughout the late 2300s and into the modern era. They carried cargo between settlements too small for larger ships. They surveyed unmapped systems. They carried mail, passengers, and supplies along the outer edge of explored space. But the halberd's post-runner history had a much stranger chapter as well. After the Reaver disclosure crisis, the conquered naval authority quietly began purchasing halberds for its own use, not as warships, as scout vessels, pursuit cutters, frontier patrol ships. The conquered, which had spent 2 centuries insisting that small, fast ships were beneath its dignity, suddenly could not commission halberds fast enough. By 2410, every conquered patrol squadron operating in frontier space included at least 4 halberds. By 2430, the standard conquered scout vessel was a direct evolution of the original Cabrera design, with gravimetric sails and a low-signature hull. The runners had not been defeated. They had been absorbed. The conquered had spent decades chasing a ship it could not catch. And then, when it finally accepted that the ship was simply better, it adopted the design and called it its own. The halberd's influence on naval architecture is enormous. The principles it popularized, gravimetric sail propulsion, low-signature hull design, small crew operation, influenced virtually every patrol vessel built in the century that followed. The fast couriers of the 2450s, the long-range scouts of the 2480s, the modern conquered pursuit cutters used right now in the outer sectors, all owe a direct design debt to the halberd tradition. Even today, the halberd's influence persists. Modern racing vessels use sail rigs that would be recognizable to a 24th century Ganymede shipwright. The basic gravimetric principles that made a halberd fast, the same principles that allow a modern scout to ride magnetic currents across an unmapped sector, are unchanged. But the halberd's greatest legacy might be cultural rather than technical. The era of human runners, the years that gave us Hollis Drayton and Marcus Vance and Naomi Karsh, and the secret evacuations through the dust, was made possible by a specific piece of technology arriving at a specific moment in history. Without the halberd, human piracy in the outer drift would have been a very different phenomenon. Slower, less widespread, less successful. And the Reaver people almost certainly would not have survived. The human runners of the drift era were not just criminals. They were, in a very real sense, the only people in known space who recognized what was actually happening on the frontier, and who built the tools to do something about it. They exploited the geography ruthlessly. They exploited the technology ruthlessly. And by the time the conquered figured out what they had been doing, they had already reshaped the map of the outer drift, saved a civilization the official histories were trying to erase, and created a design legacy that has lasted 400 years. All because a shipwright on Ganymede figured out a better way to catch a magnetic current. The next time you see a conquered patrol ship out near the edge of the drift, look closely. Chances are it is not the massive destroyer with the naval authority crest that the propaganda films love to show. If you are actually watching real frontier traffic, it is probably something much smaller. Lower signature, 2 booms instead of 4, sails running along the length of the hull instead of fixed engines flaring at the stern. It is a halberd, the ship that made humans impossible to catch. The ship that drove conquered admirals to early retirement. The ship that changed how wars were fought, how trade was conducted, and how an entire region of space was eventually policed. And it started as an ice hauler. If you found this one interesting, there is another story that connects directly to this one. The story of how the conquered naval authority finally adapted, swallowed its pride, and built the first generation of patrol ships specifically designed to chase halberds through the dust. That story is in the next archive entry. Subscribe to the Galactic Memory Vaults if you want more accounts like this one. We cover the forgotten history behind the ships, technologies, and people who shaped known space. I will see you in the next one.